coming up on FaceTime.
一带一路 is China becoming a responsible stakeholder, that these investments that China is going to make is going to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, is going to create trade routes that existed centuries ago but have basically died because of the poverty. It's going to help when you lift people out of poverty the way China is planning on doing.
The Belt and Road Initiative is proposed by Chinese President Xi Jinping. This initiative seeks to connect Asian, European, and African countries more closely and promote mutually beneficial cooperation through the land-based Silk Road economic belt and the ocean-going maritime Silk Road. It aims to develop infrastructure, promote trade and investment, as well as enhance cultural exchanges along the Belt and Road. As this project is widely covered at home, what do people in the United States think about the idea of China connecting countries in the world? Do you think it sounds like a good idea?
I think it's a great idea because it's connecting countries and helping people to get a better life. I think if you do construction, I think it's always a good idea because it's help to grow as a country and give people like job opportunities and make them a better living.
Where are you from?
I'm originally from Hungary, but we are just here with my girlfriend for a holiday.
I'm from Germany, actually.
Germany. Okay,
Yeah.
do you think that would be a good idea for Germany?
I mean, infrastructure in general, definitely, I would say.
If everything is connected, as you said, it would be better for all the people who live here or who want to visit. It would be faster, faster access to the city.
Where are you from?
Peru.
Do you think it sounds like a good idea?
Sure.
Why?
It's always good to connect things
Why do you think it's good to connect things?
because we're becoming a smaller and smaller world, and it's good to be interconnected and easier for communication and travel and business.
Where are you from?
Canada.
Oh, you're from Canada.
Yeah.
Anything that connects multiple countries is always a good idea. Anything that can improve business, good idea. Anything that can make travel easier, good idea.
Where are you from?
I'm from Australia.
Building railroads and pipelines is always a good idea. For the world, you get infrastructure, which is a good thing, both in Africa and Asia.
If China wants to open itself out to the rest of the world, then obviously it has to have the right lines of communication, and for that you have to have transport and so on. So yes, from that point of view, yes.
Yes, I would agree that very much so. The world needs to be better connected to move resources and people, and that promotes peace and harmony, and I think absolutely it's a very good idea.
Great.
Okay.
Where are you guys from?
Thank you.
From Scotland.
Scotland, yeah.
Do you think it will be countries like Scotland will be interested in participating, for example, investing or be part of this project?
Well, I don't see any reason why it shouldn't. In practical terms, whether that happens or not, I'm not sure. We're having a general election in the next day or two, and that could change everything in the world. So, yeah.
I think that Scotland were to benefit in terms of jobs and technological advance, which both countries could share. That would be a good idea.
China says it will take full advantage of the existing bilateral and multilateral cooperation mechanisms to push forward the building of the Belt and Road. This multi-trillion-dollar plan spans more than 60 countries and 30% of the world's GDP. How do American experts view this initiative and its potential impacts? Today, we sat down for an interview with Stephen Orlins, the president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations.
What do you think are some of the potential impacts of this initiative on China, participating countries, and the rest of the world?
In 2005, the then Deputy Secretary of State, who later went on to become President of the World Bank, Robert Zoellick, gave a speech at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations annual dinner. And it talked about how China had grown up and should become a responsible stakeholder. A responsible stakeholder. What we're seeing with 一带一路 is China becoming a responsible stakeholder, that these investments that China is going to make is going to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, is going to create trade routes that existed centuries ago but have basically died because of the poverty. It's going to help when you lift people out of poverty the way China is planning on doing. It will reduce the breeding of terrorism, because terrorism breeds in these places where there's no hope, where there's no economic growth. So by investing to its west, it's going to be great. It's going to both be great for China, great for those countries, and in my view, great for the world. From the United States point of view, we should celebrate that China is joining the international community in such a productive way. Our companies should participate to the extent possible in the building of whether it's dams or roads or tunnels or power plants or whatever it is, should participate with Chinese companies in those projects, which again, when you do a project together, it draws the countries together closely. So in my view, this is an enormous positive. It's China entering the international stage in a very productive and constructive way. And if it works, it really will do great things for the world. And what it also creates is a market. When people are poor, they don't buy Chinese goods, they don't buy American goods. When they have money, they buy Chinese goods, and sometimes they even buy American goods. So it's a real positive, and the United States should be better at celebrating these kinds of things, because the United States was not going to go to these places with massive amounts of aid the way China is.
So how do you think American companies can participate in this project?
So we see General Electric working with some of these are going to be power plants supplying the turbines. We see Bechtel, we see Halliburton, working on construction projects with Chinese companies. There are lots and lots of U.S. companies that can provide goods and services to these OBOR projects.
So how do you think China and the U.S. can work together to promote infrastructure investments around the world, including and not limited to the Belt and Road Initiative?
What you need is the relationships. So if, GE bids with, China Power to build, and they strengthen that relationship, then it will get repeated all around the world. But you need the relationships, the foundational relationships, in order to be able to accomplish these joint infrastructure projects around the world.
The National Committee on U.S.-China Relations is a non-profit organization that encourages understanding and cooperation between the U.S. and China. As the president, Steve has been committed to building a constructive Sino-U.S. relationship throughout his life. If you stay abreast of Sino-U.S. relations, you are probably very familiar with his name. Prior to becoming president, he was the managing director of Carlyle Asia, one of Asia's largest private equity funds, and the chairman of the board of Taiwan Broadband Communications, one of Taiwan's largest cable television and high-speed internet providers. So what has he done to further Americans' understanding of China, and how has China shaped his life?
As the president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, what do you hope to achieve?
Well, what we hope, we want to educate Americans about China and Chinese about America. We fundamentally believe to the extent that each country understands the other better, we will have better policies that strengthen the relationship. That's kind of a simple summary of what we look to do.
In terms of strengthening the relationships, what are you doing specifically to achieve this goal?
Well, we have virtually every issue in the U.S.-China relationship. We have programs that are aimed at improving them. We look to the next generation. A lot of our programs, 7 of our programs, are aimed at identifying people in the next generation who are going to play a role in U.S.-China relations. So we have something called the Public Intellectuals Program. We just completed last week the Foreign Policy Colloquium. We have our Young Leaders Forum, where we identify each year 10 outstanding Chinese under the age of 40.
These sound like very exciting programs, and you play a very important role in educating Americans about China. And I'm very curious to know where your interest in China came from. I know that you first signed up for a Mandarin class at Harvard back in 1970. Back then, Chinese wasn't a very common foreign language to study in colleges, I suppose. So what was your motivation to study Chinese back then?
Lady, you've done some great research, but the answer to that question is a fairly long story, so I will tell you the full story. 1970, on April 30th, President Nixon expanded the war into Cambodia. So it formerly was limited to Vietnam. He expanded it into Cambodia. Harvard and every other campus around the United States exploded in protest. Every window in Harvard Square was broken. The administration at Harvard decided to close rather than risk additional violence. School is closing. I'm leaving Cambridge to come back to New York. And I see one of my professors and I say to him, I want to start studying Vietnamese to understand why good people, the American government, do bad things, the war in Vietnam. Maybe if I understood Asia better, I would understand why these mistakes were made.
And you were an undergraduate?
I was an undergraduate. I was a sophomore at Harvard. And he said, he was this august, wonderful Harvard professor, and he said, if you're going to want to learn about Asia, you should study Chinese. And if you're really interested, I can get you a fellowship to do it. The whole conversation lasted about 45 seconds. About 4 weeks later, a letter arrived, which was from the Pentagon, actually, and I was given a National Defense Foreign Language grant to begin the study of Chinese, and I was quite good, and I kept up the study of Chinese. But that's why I began to understand why it was that the United States had adopted these policies that I think were fundamentally wrong. And when I think back to that time, I actually understand why I do what I do today. Because in many ways, what I do today is to make sure that America understands Asia in a way that we formulate the right policy.
So you think being able to understand Chinese help you further understand China?
Absolutely. I think I have a fundamentally more nuanced view of how China operates. I understand history, culture, tradition, and anything that happens in China, I see more through the eyes of a Chinese than through the eyes of a Westerner. I mean, friends always joke, they say, 你真的是一般中国人，一般美国人. And there's probably a lot of truth to that today. That over time, I mean, friends always joke that I've picked up many things that Chinese do and Westerners don't do as much anymore. So it's okay. Everybody says, 你吃中国菜吗？我说我现在不吃西餐，我天天吃中国菜。So it's always a funny conversation.
You were one of the very first few Americans who traveled to China when China and the US established diplomatic ties in 1979. Ever since then, you've been visiting China frequently and have done businesses with China for over 3 decades. And you once said that China defined your life. How so?
My interaction with China since, really 1976, since I joined the State Department, has kind of defined the contribution that I've made to society, the contribution that I've made to the world. So I think, the U.S.-China relationship and what I've done vis-a-vis China has really defined who I am. In 1979, I arrived in Beijing, and when I contrast that to today, it's simply unimaginable. the changes. And I still remember from the Beijing airport to the Beijing Fandian, where I was to live for the next 2 years, it was midnight. It was quite late. We did not pass one car on the road. There were mache, there were bicycles, but there were no other cars. And I remember the next morning, so the morning of October 20th, I remember I said, oh, there's a parade outside. I heard all this noise and tumult outside, and our room was facing Chang'an-jie. And I opened the curtains, and it was rivers of bicycles. And they were ringing their bells, and that's what the noise was. It was rivers. You couldn't cross Chang'an-jie. There were no cars, but the rivers of bicycles. And when I go to those same spots today, I'm simply astounded. In this short period of 38 years, I've witnessed a change which should have taken 10 generations. I mean, can you imagine that? People look different. They're bigger, they're healthier. It's quite amazing.
While China plans to build a trade-supporting infrastructure across the world through its Belt and Road Initiative now, it had just begun to develop its own infrastructure at home in the 1970s. Places like Guangdong have experienced enormous changes over the past 4 decades. As a member of the legal team that helped establish diplomatic ties between China and the U.S., Steve witnessed all of these changes.
You first went to Beijing in 1979, you mentioned. When was the first time you went to Guangdong?
I went to Guangzhou in 1980, and we had meetings in Guangzhou about setting up an orange juice factory.
Oh, orange juice factory.
Orange juice, yep, Chengzhi. Then I went to Shekou, Shenzhen Shekou, to take advantage of the new special economic zones policies. You have to remember that Beijing, the transportation system in China was so backward that you couldn't get fresh vegetables to Beijing during the winter. So the only vegetable I ate in the winter was bai cai, which would just go up and they would kind of store it on the streets. But then I'd go to Guangzhou and you'd be able to get every kind of food and every kind of vegetable. So we liked going to Guangzhou a lot, especially during the winter.
For fresh vegetables.
For the fresh vegetables, yes. Yes.
Guangdong obviously has changed so much for the past 3 or 4 decades. And you've experienced the changes. What are your thoughts on Guangdong's development?
A few weeks ago, I was in Foshan, where I had been in 1993. In Foshan, Guangzhou, Beijing, it's totally different. That the cities have physically changed so much. That the people, even though the culture has remained somewhat intact, the people have so fundamentally changed. Their standard of living is totally different. Their freedom to travel, their freedom to study, their freedom to study what they want. It makes me an optimist. Because when I look at people like you, when I look at the next generation, and I know that they have their feet in both countries, that they understand both countries. They grew up in one system, they may live in another. It's going to increase understanding to the point where what I do, I hope, is no longer necessary.
How do you see the Sino-US relationship evolve and change in the new global political scenario, especially after the Trump-Xi meeting in April?
Expect to see the infrastructure investment we've talked about. I expect to see, further cooperation, creation of dialogues which would help kind of resolve questions when they come up.